In this video, we're going to practice color coding two synoptic passages using the color coding method introduced in the top 5 on the synoptic problem. So you should have some colored pencils handy, and also we will be working from Burton Throckmorton's Gospel Parallels book, specifically section 89, which is a triple tradition passage on Jesus's true relatives, and then also section 64, which is titled John's Question to Jesus. Let's go ahead and jump on in. The first passage that we are going to engage is in what is called the triple tradition. That is those episodes that are shared between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where Mark is the center term, and we have Luke and Matthew on either side of Mark, both having access to and looking at Mark, and Luke perhaps having access to and looking at Matthew, depending on what synoptic solution one holds to, whether it be the two-source theory, wherein Luke would not be looking at Matthew, or the farer theory, wherein Luke would be looking at Matthew. So what we're looking at in this first passage is a triple tradition passage. So we're going to have multiple different colors, more colors at play in our color coding schema than we will with respect to double tradition passages. So by way of reminder, we use the primary colors for our 3 synoptic gospels. We have Mark as our center term in red, Matthew as our term on the left in blue, and Luke as our term on the right in yellow. So the various combinations of the different synoptic gospels are going to make different colors on the color wheel. What I want you to do is have this passage open and ready and practice marking along yourself. There's not necessarily a right answer when it comes to color coding the synoptic passages. Remember, this is a tool for observing similarities and differences between the Gospels. So I want you to get the practice of marking the text yourself and check with what I do as a point of comparison, not check with what I do to give you necessarily the right answer. We're going to start with what we find across all 3 Gospels. That is what is shared between Mark and Matthew and Luke. The combination of red and blue and yellow is going to make brown. So we're going to mark this stuff in brown. Let's start with the first half of the episode right up here. I'm going to mark it this way. We have his mother and his brothers and the pronoun him in all 3 of the synoptic gospels. There's a little bit of difference in the framing between the different gospels, but all of them have Jesus's mother and his brothers there and them approaching him in some way. So next we're going to move down here. I invite you to go ahead and pause and mark in brown what you find across all 3 gospels down here. So for me, it's going to look like this. Once again, the phrase, the subject of the sentence, your mother and your brothers, is shared across all 3, and their location outside, wanting something to do with the pronoun, the second person pronoun you. There's going to be a little bit of fidgeting, a little bit of changing with what they're doing, or what the mother and brothers want to do with Jesus. The next thing I want to look at, we're going to move back up here, and I tend to go to the Mark-Matthew overlaps next, because usually we're going to have more Mark-Matthew overlap than anything else when it comes to marking triple tradition passages. So right up here, go ahead and mark anything that you're going to, just right up here, anything that you are going to find shared just between Mark and Matthew. It is missing in Luke. The combination of red and blue is going to make purple. And so it looks like this. It is what the mother and the brothers are doing. They are standing outside in both Mark and in Matthew. And let's go ahead and move down here and see what our similarities are between Mark and Matthew down here that are not included in Luke over here. So mark this area in purple as well. Right, so it's a very simple thing. It is just the someone telling him. So in the case, it's just him, but they are speaking to Jesus using different verbs here. But both Matthew and Mark have the him here, whereas Luke has a him, but it's in a little bit of a different context. It's not in the context of speaking to Jesus. So the next thing I want us to do is move back up here to the Mark and Luke overlap. So what we find in Mark and Luke that is not over here in Matthew. So go ahead and mark that. A combination of red and yellow is going to make orange. And so it's going to be some simple things. We've got the way it is introduced with then, whereas Matthew over here has while. And then also the verb came is shared between the two accounts. So that's all that I have for orange is the then and the came, at least up here. Let's move on down here and find what overlaps in orange we have down here. So only in Mark and Luke do we have a crowd. Matthew does not mention the crowd here. So the next thing I want you to do is just looking at what is only in Mark. So you have to look over to the other ones, but marking in red, what you see is unique to Mark, starting up in the top here. And so it's going to be essentially the rest of this, the they sent and they called. So what his mother and his brothers are doing, the verbs here are sent and called uniquely in Mark. And let's do the same thing down here, again in red, marking what is unique to Mark. This is going to be the sitting around him and said to him. And the sisters, so Mark is the only one to include specifically sisters, and the asking. So what the family members are doing is asking in Mark, and it's going to be different in Matthew and in Luke. So the next thing I want us to do is look across the gap here and see if we see anything that should be in green. A combination of yellow and blue makes green. Anything that's shared between Matthew and Luke that is not present in Mark. And for me, it's going to look like this. The bit about being told. So told is the verb in Matthew and in Luke, and then are standing and wanting are also included in both Matthew and in Luke. So this is an example of a minor agreement between Luke and Matthew, and we need to remember that when it comes to the triple tradition, those places where there is an episode in all three synoptic gospels, there is not usually thought to be a Q passage. Q is usually thought to be a sayings source, not containing narrative material, but just saying sayings of Jesus. And so in this case, the green has to be explained one of two ways, depending on what theory one holds to. Under the two-source theory that holds that Luke does not look at Matthew at all, there is no line connecting Matthew and Luke, the green is explained as sort of circumstantial ways that both Matthew and Luke are changing Mark. They both add this standing and this wanting, and they both add the verb told. Whereas for the Farrer theory, which holds that Luke is in fact looking at Matthew, does have access to Matthew, the Farrer theory is going to say Luke looks at Matthew and follows these small changes, these minor changes that Matthew makes to Mark. And the next thing I want us to do here is look for what is just going to be in blue, just as we did for Mark in red. Let's see what we can find with respect to Matthew that is only going to be in Matthew. So we're going to underline it in blue. So here we have while he was still speaking to the crowds and wanting to speak. So the way that the sort of group is introduced, And I guess if you had crowd here and here and here, this crowd as a brown bit, that would be perfectly acceptable. Once again, as you do this color coding, you sort of notice things. I just noticed in this act right now that crowd is up higher in Matthew than it is Mark and Luke. So if I were to go back and do this again, I may in fact make crowd into brown because it's up here. But it also would be acceptable to leave it in orange insofar as Luke and Mark have it in the same location. So you could imagine a case where Luke is following Mark and brings crowd down here. And when Matthew is following Mark, he brings the crowd higher up into the introduction to the passage. And then the other thing is the wanting to speak to him, as well as the person that tells Jesus what is going on. It's just a someone in Matthew, and he introduces the saying that's in all three gospels with look, a command to Jesus saying, look. We also have the mother and brothers wanting to speak. This is the thing that they want to do rather than in Mark, where they are asking for Jesus. And the last thing to do here is look for what is unique to Luke, what is just in the yellow here. So go ahead and underline what is left or what you can find here in yellow. So we have them wanting to see Jesus, as well as the fact that they could not reach Jesus is uniquely in yellow. And I have not, you may have noticed, I have not coded this here because it's starting to move into the next thing. If we were to mark it, it would be, of course, marked in blue because it doesn't appear as a transition in Mark or in Luke. The next passage we are going to deal with is a double tradition passage. It is section 64 in Throckmorton's Gospel Parallels, John's question to Jesus. So we're going to need fewer colors here because the double tradition is only that material which appears in Matthew and Luke and does not show up in Mark. This is largely saying and teaching material, which goes to the theory that the Q source under the two source theory is largely a saying source, a collection of Jesus's sayings that both Matthew and Luke use. So in this passage, we are not going to have that middle term of Mark. So we're just going to be using a handful of colors. It's the material that's shared between Matthew and Luke, and two different theories about why it is shared. Under the two source theory, again, we have that hypothetical source document Quelle, which means source in German, shortened to Q normally in Synoptic Gospels scholarship. So one explanation is that Matthew and Luke are independently looking at a different document and they do not know one another. Luke does not know Matthew. Matthew does not know Luke. The Farrer theory does not hypothesize the existence of this hypothetical source document Q. They say it probably did not exist, and the reason for the overlap between Matthew and Luke is that Luke writes after Matthew and uses both Mark and Matthew. Let's go ahead and jump on into our double tradition passage and get to marking. So with this double tradition passage, again, we have Matthew in blue, Luke in yellow. The combination of blue and yellow is going to be green. So only three colors at play here: blue, yellow, and green. And when I'm marking a double tradition passage, I look for the overlaps first. I look for those things that are shared between Matthew and Luke and mark those in green. So let's go ahead and start by marking this top part up here. Anything that you see shared between the two in green. And then, of course, anything that is not shared in this top part is going to uniquely be blue or yellow. So if you want to sort of mark the green and then mark the blue and the yellow at the same time, that would be perfectly acceptable. So we have in both both Matthew and in Luke, the fact that John is at play here. John the Baptist is at play. He's mentioned at the beginning, but he's mentioned in sort of different kinds of ways. So to mark our blue over here in Matthew, if you have not done that already, go ahead and pause and mark what is unique to Matthew in blue. And it's going to look a bit like this. We have when John, that's the part shared, heard in prison what the Messiah was doing, he sent, and this is going to be shared, word by his disciples, which is going to be shared, and said to them, and then what is said is indicated. Over here, we have in yellow, unique to Luke, the disciples of John, not unique, reported all these things to him. So John summoned two of his disciples, these are going to be shared in just a second, and sent them to the Lord to ask. So if we mark those in green, we have John's disciples being sent, shared between both passages here. And then when we move down just a touch, we're going to also mark these ones in green because this question is identical between the two. Are you the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another? So the exact same wording there. And you'll notice a large space in Matthew indicating that there is nothing here of what there is in fact in Luke. So we're going to mark that whole paragraph in yellow there. Luke has inserted something else, either from Matthew, if under the two source theory, Luke is looking at Matthew, he's decided to interrupt Matthew and put this in here. So that's one option of where this material comes from. Under the two source theory, the other option would be that either Luke inserts this material after the material he gets from Q, or Matthew has decided to omit this. This may have been in Q. Matthew decides to omit it, and Luke decides to leave it in. So then the question becomes, what makes the best sense of the insertion or the presence or absence of this material? Does it make most sense that Luke inserted it from Matthew? Does it make most sense that Luke inserted it from another source? Or does it make most sense that Matthew omitted it from another source? And as to what it is, it's simply sort of just a summary statement of what Jesus had done, that he cured many people of diseases, plagues, evil spirits, and given sight to many who were blind. Many of those things are going to be repeated right down here. So you could say because it's repeated, it would make sense that maybe Matthew took it out because of the nature of the repetition. Or it could be that Luke put it in from the Q source or from Matthew as a way to introduce the quotation that's going to be right there. So different sort of explanations for why that material is present in Luke and absent in Matthew. So the next thing I want to do is move down here and look to what is unique to Matthew what is shared between Matthew and Luke down here, and what is unique to Matthew and Luke respectively down here. And so what we're going to see is that Jesus and here and C are going to be marked in blue as unique to Matthew, whereas he, so rather than using Jesus's name here, presumably because Jesus is named right here, Luke has it as he, have seen and heard. So notice those are the same verbs, but they are slightly different tenses. This is what is called the perfect tense. It is action that started in the past and continues into the present, whereas this is simply the present. They are hearing and seeing right now. So I mark these as different. You might have marked them as green, as shared, but because of the slight change in tense, I've marked them just a little bit differently. And then you have the vast majority of this Jesus saying, this Jesus answering to John's disciples, go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have good news brought to them, and blessed is anyone who takes no offense at me. So all of this is shared. The question is whether it is shared because Luke is taking over it from Matthew, or whether both Matthew and Luke are taking it over from the other source, a different saying source called Q, as under the two source theory.